This is the Mind Body Detox Podcast, where we discuss all things integrative health and wellness, interviewing folks from all over the world, sharing insights and wisdom for how to live a healthier life in mind, body, and spirit. Welcome back, everyone, to the Mind Body Detox Podcast. I'm your host, Mind Body Medium Kara Lovehart. And if you or yourself have a child or you are on the spectrum, have OCD, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, you don't want to miss this episode. So I am bringing on the podcast today Dr. Robert Melillo. He's one of the world's leading experts in brain development and neurobehavioral disorders. So he has over 30 years experience as a clinician, a professor, researcher, and best-selling author. So he has dedicated his career to understanding how the brain and body are connected to shape our mental, emotional, and physical health. He's also the creator of the Melillo method. It's a groundbreaking multimodal approach that's helped thousands of children and adults with ADHD, autism, OCD, dyslexia, depression, and helping them find real lasting results and improvement. He's also the co-founder of one of the organizations that my son, who's on the spectrum, went to, which is the Brain Balance Achievement Centers. So he's also the author of the international best-selling book, Disconnected Kids. This is now released in its third edition and is translated into 16 languages. From running the Melillo Center for Developing Minds in New York to directing the National Institute for Brain and Rehabilitation Sciences and hosting Everything Brain podcast, Dr. Melillo's passion for integrating science and holistic healing truly shines through, and I am so excited to bring him on today to have some amazing questions lined up for him. So come on, let's get you on, Dr. Melillo. Nice to meet you. Thanks so much for being here on the show with us today.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you. Such a lovely introduction.
Awesome. Let's just start with the beginning. What inspired you to start working with these populations of adults and children? What's your story with that?
I'm a clinician, and right from the beginning, one of the things I went into my field was because I was an athlete who had a lot of injuries, and I was interested in working with that. But then when I was in graduate school, I fell in love with neurology and neuroscience and wanted to find a way to combine rehab with neuroscience in some way. And that's basically where my career has been. And I started off early on focusing on a diplomate in neurology and then rehabilitation. But then around 10 years in, one of my kids was diagnosed with ADHD, and I didn't know what that was. And I wanted to know what it was because I was already teaching clinical neurology and I already had a pretty good background in that. So I wanted to feel like, okay, what can I do to help him in some way? And so I just wanted someone to tell me what was happening in the brain, and nobody really could. And so I decided that I needed to do the research myself. So I dove into it. And then about 10 years later, I published a book called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood and Evolutionary Perspective, where I did collaborate with some top researchers and my main research partner who had been doing it for 30, 40 years. And that book set it off. In the midst of developing that and writing that, I was developing a program as a clinician to be able to help my son and other kids. And it was very successful. And then eventually I started working with kids and non-speaking kids on the autism spectrum. And first few kids I worked with, they started speaking after a few weeks, and it was pretty remarkable. And for me, it was just the most important thing I could do in life. So that's where this passion started for me, and it's only gotten more so since.
Yeah, it's so amazing. And I'm so grateful for the work you're doing. And I know there's hundreds of thousands of parents and people, adults and children, that have been working with you over the years. And I think that the thing that's fascinating to me is that every day, still, I have a clinic here in South Central Pennsylvania, and we still have education to do for helping people to know there's other options, that the medication isn't maybe necessarily addressing the root cause. And I have people say all the time when they discover that they have let's just say an ADHD or an autism diagnosis, parents that come and see me a lot, since I work with people who are highly sensitive on the spectrum, they come for more of the body work piece, but they have a hard time understanding that when they get the diagnosis, this is going to be the answer. Like, okay, And sometimes they're relieved. Oh, I found out I have ADHD. That's my issue. That's my problem. And then it's almost like this sentence of life. This is what I'm going to have to deal with for the rest of my life. And I've never had this ability, because I'm not a clinician, to say, well, actually, that can be healed. So a lot of your work is one of the things I feel find very fascinating. So could you tell us a little bit about your perspective on that when you have people that come in with these diagnoses, these sentences, it seems like that it's going to be how it is, and how you work with that to support healing, and how far can it go?
Yeah, I think looking at it from the perspective of the neurodivergent movement has really been helpful, because really these are built on traits. And there are some people are born with certain areas of their brain that are stronger. When we say someone's talented or gifted or intelligent, what does that mean? It literally means, from a neuroscience perspective, that there are areas or networks or connections in their brain that may be naturally stronger than other people. But when you have that, you also may have areas on the other side that might be a little bit weaker than other people. And we all have these strengths and weaknesses, and that makes us unique to who we are, and that makes every person different, and that's great. But if those strengths and weaknesses get too far apart, then they can lead to unusual gifts, but they can also lead to unusual disabilities. And that's basically what's happening. And the thing is, we're not trying to heal or cure people per se. We're trying to create a balance in those networks. And we can do that. We can target the areas that are underactive or underdeveloped, and we can strengthen those to match their strengths. So effectively take away their strengths we take away their weaknesses without take away their strengths. And it really comes down to understanding the brain and how the brain functions. And this is where I think the biggest issue and the biggest message problem is, quite honestly, I've spent my whole career doing this. I have multiple degrees. I have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience, and I understand it and how it integrates, how the brain regulates every aspect of the body and all of that. Very few people do. Many people may know the body, they may know diet and nutrition or functional medicine. Many people may know body work or the sensory systems. Some people may know the brain from a standpoint of an organic injury or illness, like a typical neurologist, but really how that all works together. And that's the thing, that's the perspective I think I have that very few people have as a clinician and as a researcher. Those combined things together have given me an insight into how we can change the brain in a way. And traditional medicine, traditional psychology, they don't address the core root problem because they don't know what it is.
Yeah. And that systems approach, that model of having a lot of information, a lot of training, a lot of experience, so you can connect the pieces, is what makes your work so incredible. And anyone that's in whatever field they're working in, I think at this time that they're taking a systems approach to things, they're creating something that's so different and unique. And I think really that root cause model. So are you interested and open to sharing, maybe from a linear perspective, if possible, if you were going to take an individual case of someone, from the factors that come into someone's journey that does shape the brain, that can lean towards OCD, autism, ADHD, whether it be birth things, diet, trauma. I'd love to have some examples for the audience to see how this could line up, and maybe walk them through a simplistic view of that systems approach of how things could line up for someone's brain to develop in a certain way.
Sure. The human brain is unique, and I think we know that, but I don't think we really fully appreciate how unique it is, in that there is no other brain in the planet that develops or grows like the human brain. And obviously, it starts with the fact that we have the largest brain per body size of any primate, but because we stand upright, we have the smallest birth canal. So we have a very small birth canal with a very big head. No other animal on the planet really has to deal with that. So that almost every other animal, the majority of their brain grows in the womb or in some controlled setting, like an egg or something like that. So that most of it is growing there. When they're born, they're pretty much almost adult size. Humans, because we have to restrict the size of our brain and our head in the womb, otherwise it won't get out. When our brain is born, it's only about 20 or 25% of the adult size. So that means that almost 80% of our brain development happens outside the womb, which means all of those little milestone steps are actually hugely important. And people are told that doesn't matter, that you can develop any way possible. The human brain is one of the most complex things in the universe. To think that it can just develop any way in doesn't matter doesn't really make much sense. It really matters a lot. And so again, right from the beginning, pediatricians have no clue about this, about how a human brain development. And we also have the longest period of development, and our brain gets the biggest, and all the more advanced things like speech is towards the end. So any little deviation in the beginning can have a really big impact on things like speech or attention or focus or concentration. And the other thing that really makes our brain more unique is the fact that our right brain and our left brain are very different from one another. So all brains on the planet from the beginning of time were right and left. And now we know that as the more different they are, the more powerful the brain is, the more intelligent the animal is. And that happens because in the womb, starting around the 25th to 28th week, the right brain takes the lead in development for the first 3 years, keeping the left brain intact. And then the left brain comes on for the next 3 years. That forms the foundation of the right brain and the left brain. And that is great. And as our brain matures, they become more and more specialized, but they also have to become more and more integrated and balanced. And that's the challenge. And anything that throws off any of those milestones or that sequence of movement or development can lead to certain areas of the brain coming on too strong and too early, or too late and too weak. And these create these imbalances. And once there's too much of an imbalance, it doesn't self-correct. And this is what adds up to all the symptoms that we see in people.
Yes. So can you give us examples as far as, would it be falls? Is it emotional heightened trauma or experiences? Is it food? Is it toxins? What are some of the things that will take and reroute the natural development? Some examples of those.
So my third book right now, there's a lot of in the news because of what's happening with RFK and a lot of things out there about causes of autism. And I wrote a book on this in 2013. It was the first book really anybody ever wrote on it, about were there ways of potentially preventing or minimizing your risk of having a child with a disability. And so in that book, there was about 50 different lifestyle environmental factors that have a correlation with, if this is there, there's an increased risk. But as we're seeing, like, this whole messaging around Tylenol is ridiculous because it's basically making it sound like Tylenol causes autism. And that's not what the research says at all. There may be a correlation, but what does that mean? We have no idea. Nobody is describing, what is the actual mechanism that Tylenol could cause autism? There isn't any. And also the idea that there are other factors involved. But the bottom line is, nobody's talking about what autism is in the brain. And if you don't understand that, then you really can't understand how someone may cause it or something may cause it or not. Bottom line is, from my perspective, and again, I did a lot of research on this, any environmental factor, whatever it is, if it's age, mom being over 35, dad being over 40, and most of these factors, by the way, are preconception factors, meaning before you have a baby, there's methylation of your genes, and 84% of the genes we have are there to build brain development. They are the most sensitive genes because the brain is designed to be adaptable. That's what makes our brain so unique, but it also makes it very vulnerable, because if those environmental factors don't show up when they're supposed to, or they're not there, then they can again tip this delicate balance, this dynamic balance of our brain. And so any of these environmental factors, whether it's toxins in the environment, organophosphates, phthalates, plastics, hormone disruptors, essentially what they're doing is they're altering the expression of the genes that have to do with building the brain, because they're 84% of the genes. If anything's going to be impacted, it's probably those genes. And they are the most sensitive. But there is no damage, there is no injury, there's no gene mutation the vast majority of the time. There is no metabolic disease per se. So it's something that can be changed. And that's the idea, is it alters the trajectory of brain development. And my work really at the root cause really revolves around movement is what initiates brain development. We need to move to initiate brain development, but our brains are so immature at birth, babies don't have any control, and they won't have really any voluntary control over movement for a year or two. And so we're born with these things called primitive reflexes. And if those reflexes don't show up when they're supposed to or on time, and they don't go away on time, which is at 1 year, then they hold the brain back and they end up leading to these imbalances. And to me, that is the root cause most of the time.
I think that's so fascinating. When we took my son into the brain balance centers, just all the testing that was done for laterality between the brain hemispheres, eye tracking, I thought everything that was being done was like so on point when it comes to my systems brain of how I think. How I've been in, holistic integrative health for so many years, and it was something that was being addressed that therapy was just looking at, we can just medicate him on being on the spectrum, and then we later found out, so both my son and I know his brain was developing. I had lead poisoning as a child, and then later had this reintegration into an environment that had high toxicity of lead. And part of my experience was getting these symptoms of being disoriented, not being able to focus. I started seeing auras and colors around people. And so that for me was my experience. But there was like this whole piece of it, of the brain balance centers, that brought into not only the balancing, which was really fascinating, and then cross body like movements and things like that, that I just thought was so incredible. And I just feel like it's so cutting edge. So I'm kind of curious about that research as you started the brain balance centers and how those have progressed along the way. Do they now integrate more of the diet and lifestyle as well as the program, or how has it evolved over time? I'm kind of curious because they weren't there when you first started them. I think we were there in 2010.
Yeah, brain balance was really the first earliest model. And it was really based on looking at more of a kind of an academic learning center type of model. And it was really designed towards a lot of the kids that, like my children and kids that I've been working with, that were pretty high functioning, that needed a little extra help. But I've always been involved in research especially since that book came out in 2004. And so my work was always evolving. And eventually it evolved into model where I wanted to build a very sophisticated healthcare model. And that was different than brain balance. So I set up a whole different model, different organization. I wanted to work with the most challenging issues in the world and figure out a way of developing a reproducible system that could use cutting edge tools. Brain balance is not a healthcare model, so they can't use a lot of healthcare tools. I designed that for children within a certain age, but I wanted to also work with babies, and I also wanted to work with adults because it's all developmental, right? And so that's where I worked on developing the Melillo method, which was really this cutting edge multimodal approach. And that's where, again, our lab and our research really ramped it up as part of my PhD project. And several years ago, we really started doing some even higher level research. And we did the only really large randomized age match controlled double blind study looking at retained primitive reflexes in children, adolescents, and adults. And we did that as a pretty long study. And we looked at brain imaging before and after intervention. And we were able to, we've published, I think, 10 papers just in the last 3 years in some of the best journals in the world on some of that work. And now we're also publishing follow-up longitudinal data a year later on that same group and population of control. And so from that, at this point now, we've published more than anybody in the world, especially at that. And it also really informed and refined my work. In brain balance, we were just doing basically the way we assess the reflexes and the way we remediated them were through simple exercises. When you're working with kids, like on the spectrum, that don't know where their body is and don't feel their body and have no control over their body, you can't get them to do exercises. So therefore, I realized that we needed to actually stimulate the reflexes for them and do that at a high repetition, which made it relatively easier to do for both the child and the parent. And then I developed, as they progressed, more sophisticated movement and exercises that they could do as they grew, or as even people on a higher level. And that was one major thing. And the way we look at the reflexes is much more accurate. And the way we did it at Brain Balance, we may miss a lot of the reflexes, or we may think they're gone and they're not fully gone. But this way of doing it is much, much more accurate. And then we added very specific tools like QEEG and ways of measuring what's going on, but also different tools like lasers, photobiomodulation, transcranial direct and alternate current, as well as video games, virtual reality. And also, I've done a lot of work around neuroimmunology and the overlap of how the brain regulates the autonomic system and how the brain actually regulates or dysregulates the immune system in these situations as well, and come up with very sophisticated treatments that we have to target the immune system very specifically.
I find that part really fascinating. Could we go into that a little bit more? The
Yeah.
connection between maybe immune system function and brain health? Because I know I see a lot of people that are having autoimmune conditions. I see some diagnoses that they also have this interesting correlation. And something else, I don't know if it's even related, but I see a lot of hypermobility in joints and connective tissue. So and then sometimes I'm like, do you know if you have a genetic factor here? I'm always curious of what you found. That's so interesting.
Yeah. There's actually a very interesting series of papers on the idea of hypermobility and neurodivergence in ADHD and autism. And that comes down to lack of proprioception. What I've been searching for really for 30 years is a universal model. As you said, a systems model. But how do you, if you have a model, if you really understand the root cause, and you understand that all of these things are versions of one another, right? But even just a label, like ADHD, there's a right brain and there's a left brain version of ADHD. OCD, there's a right brain and a left brain. So that's why people can say, oh, I'm ADHD. And you can get one person that's highly intelligent and really is more like on the autism kind of personality style, very intelligent, really good at academics and math, but maybe not as social and really hyperactive and poor attention. And then you get someone that's actually dyslexic or is more struggle with learning disability and is very creative and very social and struggles with anxiety over people not liking them or judging them. Completely opposite personalities, but yet they both get the label of ADHD. How can that be? That's why you really need to understand from a neuroscience perspective what that means. Both of those, we have three types of ADHD, ADHD 1, 2, and 3. And they're very different and they're different areas of the brain. But either way, understanding this model means that you need to understand every version and the people that are very high functioning and speaking, and then others that, can't speak at all. And then all of the different things in the body. And so the bottom line is in 2009, we wrote a paper that understanding these imbalances in networks in the brain, and the symptoms really come from depending on what networks in one side of the brain, but then imbalances between the sympathetic and parasympathetic, where the sympathetic is on and the parasympathetic doesn't develop. That explains all of the metabolic issues, all of them. And that combination together is what really leads to all of the different symptoms that we can see in somebody. And we really defined that. And now that was 2009. In the last certain years, we've expanded that out to really understand the brain and understand this root cause of deficits of interoception, which also are related to deficits of proprioception, where they're not building these maps, these sensory motor maps on the right side of the brain, because the left side has come online too early and too strong. And that lack of proprioception relates to low muscle tone and not knowing where the joint is, which is what leads to the hypermobility. And it's all related to also that is the root cause of why kids don't speak. Nobody's ever answered that question. Why don't kids on the autism spectrum speak? What is actually preventing them? When many of them are hyperlexic. I had a kid that could read at 7 months of age. How can they read before the age of 2 but not be able to speak? So that's something that I've really dove into. We published a paper on that, but I think I really understand that. And working with the spelling and working with these kids, they've actually given us answers. But the really cool thing is the area of the brain, the right insular cortex, which is where the primary area for interoception, so pain, temperature, when I have to go to the bathroom, hunger, thirst, is also now recognized as the area for immunoception, meaning where we sense the immune system and create the balance. And the sympathetic and the parasympathetic is what creates the balance between the inflammatory and anti-inflammatory systems. And the right brain is parasympathetic and more anti-inflammatory. The left brain is more sympathetic and pro-inflammatory. And that's what we see also, that these kids are in this sympathetically dominant and sympathetic state and in this inflamed state, and they have these imbalances in their immune response.
That's very interesting. So would that look like you have maybe one patient that is more logical, very OCD, or like lining up numbers and orienting things, and you have other one that's more maybe disassociated, checked out, kind of in a dreamy space, and you have a very different orientation for their immune systems based on being in the sympathetic or the parasympathetic? Is it similar in that way?
Yeah, you get people that you can have somebody that is really left brain dominant and the more classic ADHD or the classic OCD, as you said, with things like checking or hygiene or hoarding or repetition. And they may struggle in the social realm, whatever. And they're in a more sympathetically dominant state where they're very inflamed and they have a very high, fast heart rate, maybe higher blood pressure. And then you can have someone who's maybe very right brain dominant, who is really struggling from social anxiety and a fear of rejection. They may struggle with certain aspects of learning. They're very emotional. They're very sensitive, overly sensitive to other people's emotions. And they may have a very slow heart rate, or they may have a very low blood pressure. They may pass out or faint when they stand up real quickly. And they may be where their immune system is too suppressed and they're constantly getting infections and they can't rally their system, and they may have more lower energy.
That's so interesting. And do you see a difference in the hypermobility in one population or the other? Is that just something I'm curious, or is it just
Yeah, the
depending?
hypermobility is usually more first of all, where that all starts is that all the primitive reflexes come from the brainstem and primarily the lower brainstem, the pons and the medulla. This is also where the primary nuclei for the sympathetic and parasympathetic and the vestibular system come from. And so when we're born, these reflexes are on and the sympathetic nervous system nuclei is on. And that is there for a reason, so that the baby's heart rate is like 140. It's really fast and they're in this fight or flight state. And their gut is kept really in a very immature state at that point because we want it to be that way. When people are born, human babies, they're born with a leaky gut. Very few people understand this. We're supposed to have a leaky gut because human babies don't produce antibodies yet. They won't really till the end of the first year. So they need to get that from the mom's breast milk. And that those immunoglobulins are huge proteins that wouldn't get through a normal closed up stomach lining. They're not producing acid and enzymes yet because those acid and enzymes would destroy those antibodies in the gut of the baby. And there's not a lot of blood flow to the gut or movement. But as the baby is going through that first year of development, as they're moving and hitting these milestones and the reflexes come on and go away, and as that brainstem matures, as they start eating solid food and start producing their own antibodies, now the parasympathetic nuclei comes online, inhibits the sympathetic, and now activates the gut, closes it up, and now produces acid and enzymes that not only digest the solid food, but now it creates the right pH balance for good bacteria to live, bad bacteria, yeast, mold, fungus, parasites to die. And now we break up the food. Now we increase blood flow. So now we can absorb vitamins and nutrients and minerals, and we start moving that waste along. And so we're not constipated. What we see is that when the reflexes don't go away, that sympathetic nuclei never becomes inhibited because the parasympathetic nuclei doesn't come on. And that keeps that gut open and leaky and sets a tone for dysbiosis and malabsorption and vitamin and mineral and nutrient deficiencies, and large proteins get through, which can now trigger an overactive immune system, which can trigger food sensitivities and chronic inflammation. And also in that same area is the vestibular nuclei that should be maturing, that should be taking input from our body and our neck and our inner ear and our eyes, and creating these 3D maps in our brain that lead to interoception and proprioception, where we eventually get self-awareness and embodiment and body ownership. And then we have body agency. And that doesn't happen mostly because that's all right-sided. So the kids that have the right brain delays are the ones that are most impacted with that proprioceptive hypermobility issue.
Yes. You're describing my son and myself. I'm the more sensitive, hypermobile, anxious. He's the more analytical. It's so interesting because part of my journey has been, being very hypersensitive, leaky gut, having the dysbiosis probably from a lot of things. And it's like this complex system. But I'm so glad that you walked us through this. And I think that it is very complex, but each of these pieces connects to the other of how we develop. And I'm really grateful you walked us through that for the audience. I'd like to kind of segue into talking about the hypersensitive people, the people that resonate with a hypersensitive system, people who identify as empathic, and especially so the listeners who resonate with my story as someone who's on the spectrum, neurodivergent, but also my thing is sensing the world in that way where I'm very hyper aware of sight, sounds, noises, smells, but to the degree I've learned to get into my body, so that proprioception and interoception, that part of my development was much later in my 30s because of doing detox and doing some of the brain balance things like neurofeedback. There was a lot of processes for this. And I find it really interesting that there is this whole thing now around people on the spectrum and the telepathy tapes. That's a whole big thing with this connection to the brain orienting itself to information that might be extra, if we call it extrasensory, or people identify it as maybe something that's a paranormal phenomenon. But I think that you have some really interesting insight on this that would be really great to see what your thoughts are from a neurobiological perspective on those phenomenon that people on the spectrum are experiencing.
Yeah, again, one of the things that I've really been researching, and I think that I've really been able to fully understand it now, is why don't these kids speak? And especially the full out non-speaking autistic kids, when their left brain is advanced, and we know that it is. They're all geniuses, every single one of them. They are beyond genius with their left brain, but they can't show it because they're not building these maps in their brain. They don't know where their body is. And that's what they say. If you ask them, we work with spelling, and we have been working with spelling for years with these kids. And the first question I ever ask them, and it's funny because I just had two parents that, are wonderful, and they have a 15-year-old boy who's non-speaking, and they brought him to us in New York. And they've been working with spelling for a long time. And I said, have you ever asked him why he doesn't speak? And they're like, no, we've never asked him that question. And every parent, if I ask him, or even the people that do spelling, I said, did you ever ask the child why they can't speak? And if you ask them, they'll tell you. And they've given me a lot of these answers because they are so brilliant. And they say, one kid said it perfectly. He said, I don't see my body in my brain, and so I can't move my body, and that's why I can't speak. Others say, I don't feel my tongue. I don't feel my mouth. I don't know where my body is. And so how do you explain that? And you explain it because they're not building what's called a homunculus in their parietal lobe on the right side, which is where we become a whole person, where we have an image, literally a 3D image in our brain. And the biggest part of that image, 1/3, is the mouth, the face, and the tongue and the lips for verbal and nonverbal communication, so that we can read other people's emotions, we can actually mimic them, we can feel it, but we also have to feel it to be able to speak. If we can't feel our tongue, you can't speak. But it's not because they don't have all the words. All the words are there, like beyond what we think they're there. We get kids, they start typing, and I've had kids write from an 8-year-old boy from New Zealand. The first thing he typed was he wanted to learn about quantum physics. And he was writing these terms that the mom didn't understand. And so right now, even spelling is very controversial. Traditional speech therapy doesn't like it. It's think it's wrong, because one of the things you may have to do for these kids to spell, they can't type, they can't write because they're stimming, or they don't have control of their body, or they may want to point here, but they point there, because the second biggest part of the map is the hand and the arm, another third. So between the mouth and the face and that's the two ways we're going to communicate, right? How is a child going to communicate? Either speaking or pointing or typing or writing, and they can't do any of that. But if you touch them on their arm somewhere, their brain can suddenly see their arm. And now they can move their arm, because we also develop a motor map of moving our body the way we want to once we can see it. But if we can't see it, we can't move it. So the argument is that you're moving the child's hand, you're spelling for them, you're influencing them, even though later on, when they can spell on their own, they always say, no, nobody was typing for me. But what has come out also in working with these kids, if you're working with them at any given time, I've had so many mothers that have come to me and said, I don't know how to say this, but I think my son's reading my mind. I think they understand that. And I've seen it enough. And believe me, I have people that work with me that know this, and I'm very aware of the telepathy tapes, and I've spoken to people on it, and it's a real thing. And so the problem is, how do you explain that from a neuroscience perspective? And the way that I explain it is that the same thing that gives them the ability to have these words, even when they're not taught, or know things, even read a book at 2 years or 1 year of age, their left brain is so powerful. And the same area of our brain that we talk to ourselves, I said to this, there was this one boy, the parents asked him, do you talk to yourself in your head? Because if you've never spoken, would you actually speak to yourself in your head? And he said, I do. I speak to myself in my head, but I don't know what my voice sounds like, so I use somebody else's voice. But then as we were working with him, one day he wrote to his parents, I just heard my own voice for the first time. This is so cool. You have to tell Dr. Melillo, right? And so you think about it and say that area of the brain that talks to us is also the same area that talks to other people. So if they can talk to themselves, all the words are there, but why can't they talk to others? And it's because, again, they're so disconnected from their body. But I believe that area of the brain is so powerful for them that there's some very good research. Even our research has looked at consciousness. And even Roger Penrose, who was basically Stephen Hawking's partner in discovering black holes, he's actually been writing more in the last several years on universal consciousness. And so there's thinking of consciousness is that as our brain develops a complexity and connectivity, that at a certain point, the connectivity creates something. And whether it's an emergent property of consciousness in our brain, or whether it allows us to tap into a consciousness that exists in the universe, both of those are very viable right now. And so if there is this universal type of consciousness that we can tap into, that people may lose during a seizure, during a seizure, people may become unconscious, but yet there's no physical change in their brain. right? There may be a little bit of a firing change, but what's happening where they go from being conscious to unconscious, or during the temporal lobe seizure, or when they're under anesthesia? So is it just tapping into that? And if that's the case, and their left brain is able to generate these verbal frequencies in their head at a different level, they may be able to tap into the universal consciousness, and therefore that's what telepathy would be. And I think it's a very viable thing at this point in time. And I think it's the same neuroscience that allows them to be spellers even when they can't speak or don't seem to know anything. A little bit more of that, and I think it's not a big leap to go into the telepathy area.
Thank you so much. I know we're coming up on time here, but this is exactly why I'm here as a person, as a soul on this planet, to really help be a voice in some capacity because of where I've been and how my brain is developed, and having these experiences. Like when I see people on the spectrum, people have ADHD, I see like auras or fields around people, and those people are not in their bodies. They're like this bubble of light floating in different shapes and forms, and there's different patterns. And I'm just really seeking pattern recognition for me to see these different types of personalities and what they mean. It's all very complex, but there is this correlation between they're not in their bodies. They don't have the awareness of their body. They can't find it. And that was part of my journey of finding it again. I had a very, growing up, I had selective mutism friends. Like I didn't speak very much. I was very quiet. I didn't have the capacity to speak quickly. It was very slow in my processing. And it's really interesting to just hear everything you're saying. And the capacity to tap into universal consciousness is the actual real thing for me. And that intelligence is there, this awareness of something. And it almost feels like it's the extension of my nervous system picking up information in so many different ways, and it coming through almost like when I'm in like a theta brainwave. And so this is something I would love to talk so much more on that part of consciousness and the brain development that's so fascinating to me. But, just to wrap us up here, what advice do you have for someone now as far as getting tap into your book, your resources, your clinic?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, if you have anybody in your family or yourself that's struggling with any sort of developmental, neurological, mental health issue, that you really need to find out what it is, right? The first question I ask anybody, whether they come from all over the world, is, has anybody explained to you what's happening in your child's brain or your brain? And the answer 100% of the time is no. Nobody gave me any answers whatsoever. And that should be the first question. That should be the first thing. If somebody can't explain to you why your child can't speak, don't accept from them when they tell you they will never speak. Because how do you know? You don't even know what the problem is, right? So most people out there, honestly, have no idea what they're doing. And you need to be able to first find somebody that can really explain to you what the actual problem is, and then make the decision, okay, now what treatments are available and what makes sense based on that. Nobody's doing that. And this is where my work is, and this is why I train people all over the world, and this is why we're going to be developing centers all over the world now and expanding that out. Because I think, even like we talked about, what causes these things, the reality of it. My book is out there. That's really the best resource. If you want to understand as far as the foundation of my work, the Disconnected Kids obviously is the best resource, and it gives you tools to develop your own program for yourself or for your child. But also, I have over 100 scientific papers out there, and very current papers if you really want to dive into the research. And then we obviously have our two centers in New York City, which is the pinnacle of the highest level of the way my program works, that nobody else in the world at this point has access to. And so they can go to my website, drrobertmelillo.com, and there's books and papers. But also, I think you would find very interesting, my daughter and I do a podcast called the Right Brain Podcast, WRITE. And she's a singer-songwriter, but also very sensitive like you growing up. She was dyslexic, but unbelievably talented musically. And when she went down to Nashville, she realized that everybody down there was like her. And she had gotten help from me with a lot of her issues, and she wanted to bring that to her community. So we have some of the top songwriters and musicians and creative people in the world that come on the show and talk to us about it. And I think you'd find it really fascinating. So that's another resource out there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining us. I could talk to you for another couple hours here, but those listening, please check out the resources in the show notes. So much value, so much information to share with loved ones, share with friends. But again, thank you again for being here and listening, and be well until next time, my friends. Thank you for listening to the Mind Body Detox Podcast. If you loved this podcast, share it with others and leave us a review. Your reviews help us more than you know and supports us continuing to make episodes and being heard from all over the world. You can also follow the link in our show notes to submit a topic that you would like to hear on the show.